The ledger had become Clara Reed's entire world. Ink-stained fingers tracing columns of numbers that represented every soul who passed through the Silver Pine Inn's heavy oak doors, though she herself had not stepped beyond them in 3 years. The Wyoming Territory stretched wild and untamed beyond those walls in the summer of 1878, but Clara knew it only through the stories travelers brought with them. Their tales of mountain peaks piercing clouds and valleys where elk roamed thick as cattle. She listened hungrily while keeping her eyes down, recording their stays in her perfect script, calculating their bills with mathematical precision that never failed. The inn in Wilcox had been her father's dream before fever took him, and then her mother's burden until grief claimed her too, leaving Clara at 22 with a business to run and a terror of the world beyond her desk that she could not name or shake. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the worn floorboards when the mountain man first walked through her door. Clara sensed him before she saw him, the way the air seemed to shift and thicken with his presence. She looked up from her ledger, and her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and throat. He stood well over 6 feet, shoulders so broad they nearly blocked the doorway entirely. His hair fell past his collar in waves the color of dark honey, and a thick beard covered the sharp angles of his jaw. But it was his eyes that held her, pale blue like ice on a winter creek, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away and never stop looking all at once. Muscles strained against his worn buckskin shirt, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who knew his own strength and had no need to prove it. "Need a room," he said, his voice deep and rough like stones rolling in a riverbed. "Week, maybe longer." Clara's hand trembled slightly as she dipped her pen in the inkwell. "We have availability. That will be $7 for the week, meals included. Name, Ethan Pierce." He moved closer to the desk, and she caught the scent of pine and leather and something wild she could not identify. "You the owner. I manage the establishment." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Ground floor or second, high as you got. Like to see what's coming." She recorded his information in her careful script, acutely aware of how his gaze seemed to catalog everything about her small domain behind the desk. The neat stacks of papers, the ledger with its meticulous entries, the cup of tea grown cold hours ago, the shawl draped over her chair though the summer heat made it unnecessary. "You never leave that desk?" he asked suddenly. Her hand jerked, leaving a small blot of ink on the page. She blotted it carefully before answering. "I run the inn. This is where I'm needed. Seems like a cage to me." Anger flared hot in her chest. "I did not ask for your opinion, Mr. Pierce. Your room is number 12, top of the stairs and to the left. Dinner is served at 6. He took the key she offered, their fingers not quite touching though she felt the heat of him across the space between them. "Name's Ethan, and I call things as I see them, Miss Reed. No offense meant." He climbed the stairs with the fluid grace of a predator, and Clara pressed her palm flat against the ledger to stop her hand from shaking. She told herself it was anger. She almost believed it. Ethan Pierce became a fixture of the inn over the following days, and Clara found herself hyper-aware of his presence in ways that disrupted her careful routine. He rose before dawn, returning as the sun climbed high, always nodding to her at the desk, but saying little. Other guests gave him a wide berth, sensing perhaps what she had noticed immediately, that he was a man comfortable with violence though he seemed to court none. On the 4th day, he placed a book on her desk. The leather cover was worn soft with handling, the title embossed in fading gold. "Tales of Western Exploration." Clara stared at it, then at him. "I do not understand. You watch folks when they talk about their travels. Get this look in your eyes like you are starving and they are offering bread." He tapped the book with one thick finger. Figured you might like some new stories. Something in her chest twisted painfully. That's very kind, but I have read every travel narrative in my father's collection. This would be nothing new. You have read about things. That is not the same as doing them. Some of us have responsibilities that prevent gallivanting across the territory. The words came out sharper than intended, defense against the accuracy of his observation. Responsibilities, he repeated, and something in his tone made it sound like he was testing the word's weight. Or fear. She stood so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. You presume too much, Mr. Pierce. I thank you for the book, but I must insist you keep your observations about my character to yourself. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and she felt stripped bare under that pale blue gaze. Then he picked up the book and turned toward the stairs. Ethan, he said over his shoulder. Name's Ethan, and the offer stands when you are ready to admit what is really keeping you behind that desk. Clara sat back down, her heart hammering against her ribs. She tried to return to her ledger, but the numbers swam before her eyes, and she found herself staring at the door at the rectangle of light that was the world beyond. That night, she dreamed of mountains. The next morning brought rain, summer storm clouds rolling in from the west and turning the street outside to mud. Clara watched water stream down the window glass, distorting the view of Wilcox's main thoroughfare into something unrecognizable. The inn was quiet, most guests sleeping late with nothing to do in the downpour. She did not hear Ethan approach until he was already at her desk, silent as a hunting cat despite his size. He set a cup of coffee beside her ledger, steam rising in lazy spirals. You take it black, he said. Noticed you never add cream or sugar at meals. Clara wrapped her hands around the cup's warmth, oddly touched by his observation. Thank you. You did not have to do that. Wanted to apologize for yesterday. My sister always said I got all the muscle and none of the manners. He leaned against the desk, not sitting exactly but not looming either, finding some middle ground that felt less threatening. But I meant what I said, just should have said it better. You have a sister, had. Fever took her 2 winters back. His expression did not change, but something shuddered in his eyes. She was always after me to be more civilized. Guess I am still letting her down. Without thinking, Clara reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the desk. The contact shocked through her, his skin warm and rough with calluses. She pulled back quickly, but he had already caught her fingers, holding them gently in his much larger hand. I am sorry for your loss, she said quietly. I lost both my parents to fever. My mother just 6 months after my father. That when you stopped leaving, the question should have felt intrusive, but his tone held only gentle curiosity. Clara found herself answering honestly. I left for the funeral, walked to the church and back. But then I got to the door and I could not make myself step outside again. It felt like if I left, if I stopped watching over everything, I would lose this too. The inn is all I have left of them. And you think you can keep it safe by never letting it out of your sight. I know it sounds foolish, sounds lonely. His thumb moved in a slow circle over her knuckles, and she wondered if he knew he was doing it. But I understand. After my sister died, I went deeper into the mountains than I ever had before. Figured if I went far enough, the grief could not follow. Took me a long time to learn that running away does not work any better than hiding. Clara looked at their joined hands, at the stark contrast between her ink-stained fingers and his weathered strength. What brought you back? Realized I was letting fear make me smaller. Jane, my sister, she would have boxed my ears for wasting my life that way. He squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. She would have liked you, I think. She was fierce too in her own way. I do not feel fierce, I feel trapped. Same thing sometimes. Trapped animal will fight harder than any other when it finally decides to break free. The rain continued its steady percussion against the roof, and Clara felt something shift inside her chest, like ice beginning to crack after a long winter. "Where do you go every morning?" "Scouting mostly. I am supposed to be finding a route through the mountains for a wagon company, but mostly I just ride and remember what it feels like to be alive." He straightened up, and she felt the loss of his nearness like a physical thing. "You could come with me tomorrow, if the rain clears." Terror and longing warred in her stomach. "I cannot leave the inn." "You have that boy, Thomas, who helps in the kitchen. He can watch the desk for a few hours. What if something happens? What if something does not?" He moved toward the stairs, then paused. "Offer stands, Clara. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is take that first step." He used her first name like it was natural, like they had known each other longer than a handful of days, and she found she did not mind at all. Clara did not sleep that night. She lay in her small room behind the kitchen, listening to the rain slow to a drizzle, and then stop entirely, leaving only the sound of water dripping from the eaves. She thought about her mother, who had loved this inn with a devotion that bordered on obsession after becoming a widow. She thought about her father, who had dreamed of the West and built something solid here in Wilcox before illness stole his future. But mostly she thought about Ethan Pierce, about the understanding in his pale blue eyes and the gentleness in his scarred hands, about his invitation that felt less like pressure and more like possibility. When dawn broke clear and golden, Clara made a decision that terrified her down to her bones. She found Thomas in the kitchen, the 16-year-old already stoking the fire for breakfast. "I need you to watch the desk today, just for a few hours." His eyes went wide. "You going somewhere, Miss Clara?" "Apparently I am." She changed from her usual dark dress into something more practical, a split riding skirt she had not worn since before her mother died. Her hands shook as she buttoned it, and she had to force herself to breathe slowly, to push back the panic that rose like floodwater. Ethan was already in the dining room when she came down, working his way through a plate of eggs and bacon. He looked up, saw her outfit, and his whole face transformed with a smile that made her stomach flip. "You are really doing this?" "I am terrified," she admitted, gripping the back of a chair. "But yes, before I lose my nerve." He stood, leaving his half-finished breakfast, and moved to her side. "We will go slow. Any time you want to turn back, just say the word. You will not think less of me, Clara." He waited until she met his eyes. "Facing your fear takes more courage than anything I have ever done in these mountains. I could never think less of you." The walk to the livery stable felt like miles, though it was barely 200 yards. Clara's heart hammered so hard she thought she might be sick, but Ethan walked beside her, close enough that she could feel his solidity, his presence a steady anchor as the world seemed to tilt and spin around her. She focused on breathing, on putting one foot in front of the other on the warm morning sun and not the panic screaming in her skull. "You are doing it," Ethan said quietly. "Look at you, already braver than you thought." The stableman, old Frank Morrison, nearly dropped his shovel when he saw her. "Miss Clara, that really you out and about?" "Hello, Frank. I know it has been a while." 3 years, he said, but his weathered face split in a grin. "Good to see you taking some air. Your pa would be pleased." Ethan's horse was a massive bay gelding that suited his size, and Frank brought out a gentle mare named Daisy for Clara. She had not ridden since before her self-imposed exile, but the motions came back with muscle memory, even if her hands trembled on the reins. "We can still turn back," Ethan offered, swinging into his saddle with easy grace. Clara looked back toward the inn, visible down the street, and felt the pull of it like a physical tether. It would be so easy to retreat, to go back to the safety of her desk and her ledgers. But she thought of his words about trapped animals and being brave, and she thought of her father who had loved adventure, and she turned her face away from the inn. No, I want to do this. They rode slowly through Wilcox, Clara hyper-aware of every person who stopped to stare, every whispered comment about the Reed girl finally coming out of her hiding. Her face burned with embarrassment, but Ethan rode beside her like a guard, his presence somehow making her feel less exposed. And then they were past the last buildings, on the trail that led into the foothills, and Clara felt something crack open inside her chest. The world was so much bigger than she remembered. The sky stretched overhead in endless blue, clouds drifting lazy and white toward the mountains that rose like sentinels in the distance. Pine trees filled the air with their sharp green scent, and birds called from branches in songs she had forgotten existed. The horse moved beneath her with warm, solid reality, and the morning breeze touched her face with gentle fingers. "You all right?" Ethan asked, watching her with concern. Clara realized tears were streaming down her face. I forgot it was beautiful." His expression softened. "We can go as far or as little as you want today. No expectations." They rode for an hour, following a trail that climbed gradually into the foothills. Ethan kept the pace easy, pointing out landmarks and wildlife, telling her stories about the mountains that felt both more real and more magical than anything she had read in her father's books. He showed her where a black bear had marked a tree, the claw marks still fresh in the bark. He pointed out an eagle circling overhead, riding thermals with wings spread wide. He found her wildflowers growing beside the trail, purple lupine and bright yellow balsam root, and told her their names like he was introducing her to old friends. Clara absorbed it all with desperate hunger, memorizing every detail to hoard against the moment when terror would inevitably drive her back to the safety of her desk. But as the morning stretched on, the fear began to ease, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to joy. They stopped beside a creek that ran cold and clear over smooth stones. Ethan helped her down from the saddle, his hands strong around her waist, and she felt the imprint of them even after he let go. He dug canteens from his saddlebag and they sat on sun-warmed rocks listening to the water's music. "Thank you," Clara said quietly, "for this, for pushing me. You pushed yourself. I just offered the possibility." He stretched his long legs out, somehow looking completely at ease on the uncomfortable rocks. "But you are welcome. Been a long time since I enjoyed a morning this much. Do you miss it, having someone to share things with, every day?" He was quiet for a moment watching the creek. "Jane and we did not have any other family. Our parents died when I was 17 and she was 14. Raised her myself, which probably explains why she turned out half wild. But we took care of each other. Losing her, it was like losing part of myself." "Is that why you scout alone?" "Because it hurts less, partly. But also because I got used to the solitude. Started thinking it was what I deserved, maybe." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Clara felt heat rise in her face. "You have a way of asking questions that make a man examine himself, Clara Reed. I spent 3 years watching people and listening to their stories. You learn to read between the words. What do you read in me?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. Clara thought about deflecting, about retreating into politeness, but something about the morning, about the fact that she had already done the impossible just by being here, made her bold. "I see someone who thinks his strength means he does not need anyone. Who protects himself by staying untethered, always moving, never letting anyone close enough to matter." She met his eyes. "But I also see someone who notices when a stranger takes her coffee black, who understands grief, who is gentle despite having every reason not to be. And I think you are lonely, Ethan Pierce, just like me. For a long moment he did not respond, his expression unreadable. Then he reached across the space between them and tucked a strand of her dark hair behind her ear, his touch infinitely careful. "You see too much," he said, voice rough. "And you are right about all of it." Her heart was a wild thing in her chest, and when he leaned closer, she forgot to breathe entirely. His mouth was a breath away from hers when a sound echoed through the trees, something between a scream and a roar. Ethan was on his feet instantly, every muscle tensed for danger. Mountain lion. Close. Terror flooded Clara's system, a different kind than the fear that kept her at her desk. This was immediate, primal, the knowledge that something with teeth and claws was nearby. She scrambled up, looking around wildly. "The horses," Ethan said, already moving toward where they had left the animals grazing. "Stay behind me." The lion appeared like smoke given form, materializing from the underbrush with liquid grace. It was enormous, tawny coat rippling over powerful muscles, yellow eyes fixed on the horses with predatory focus. The mare, Daisy, screamed and tried to bolt, but her reins were tied to a tree. Ethan put himself between the lion and the horses, between the lion and Clara, making himself large as he pulled a knife from his belt. The blade looked small and inadequate against the creature's size, but his hand was steady. "Hey!" he shouted, voice booming through the forest. "Get on!" "Not your meal." The lion's attention shifted from the horses to him, and Clara felt ice in her veins. The animal crouched, tail lashing, every line of its body promising violence. "Ethan," she whispered, terrified. "Stay back," he said without turning. Then louder, "Go on, get." He lunged forward suddenly, aggressive, and the movement startled the lion enough that it took a step back. Ethan pressed his advantage, shouting and waving his arms, making himself into the bigger threat. For a long, breathless moment, the standoff held, man and beast measuring each other. Then the lion turned with contemptuous grace and melted back into the trees, disappearing as quickly as it had come. Ethan stayed tense and ready for several minutes, waiting to make sure the animal was truly gone. When he finally turned back to Clara, she was shaking so hard her legs nearly gave out. He caught her, pulling her against his chest, and she could feel his heart thundering as hard as her own. "That was terrifying," she gasped into his shirt. "That was nature. Red in tooth and claw, like the poems say." But his arms tightened around her, protective and warm. "You did good, though. Stayed calm, did not spook it further." "I was frozen with fear. Same thing sometimes." He pulled back enough to look down at her face. "Still want to come out adventuring with me?" Clara laughed shakily. "Ask me when I can breathe properly again." But when they rode back toward Wilcox an hour later, moving slowly to let their nerves settle, Clara realized something important. She had been terrified by the mountain lion, true enough, but she had not wanted to run back to her desk, had not felt that suffocating need to retreat into her cage and lock the door behind her. She had felt alive in a way she had forgotten was possible. And she had felt safe, even facing down a predator, because Ethan Pierce had stood between her and danger without hesitation. The realization of what that meant, of what he was coming to mean to her, should have terrified her more than any wild animal. But as she glanced over at him, taking in the strong lines of his profile and the way sunlight caught in his honey-dark hair, Clara found she was not afraid at all. Thomas was practically vibrating with anxiety when they returned, but the inn was still standing, and no disasters had occurred in her absence. Clara felt absurdly proud of both him and herself as she reclaimed her place behind the desk, though now it felt less like home and more like just a piece of furniture. Ethan lingered as the afternoon guests began arriving, pretending to examine notices on the board near her desk, but really just staying close. Finally, as the dinner hour approached, he leaned down and spoke quietly. "You did something incredible today. I hope you know that." Clara felt warmth bloom in her chest. "Will you take me out again? Tomorrow, maybe." His smile could have lit the whole territory. "Every day, if you will come." That became their pattern over the following week. Every morning, Clara would leave Thomas in charge and ride out with Ethan, exploring the land around Wilcox in ever-widening circles. He taught her to read trail signs, to identify animal tracks in the soft earth, to judge weather by the shape of clouds gathering over the mountains. He showed her hidden valleys where wildflowers grew thick as carpets, and cold streams where trout flashed silver beneath the surface, and overlooks where you could see 3 different mountain ranges marching toward the horizon. And slowly, carefully, they learned each other. Ethan told her about growing up in Missouri, about coming west with his parents and sister to find fortune that never materialized, about his father dying in a mine collapse and his mother following 6 months later from a broken heart, leaving him to raise Jane alone, about learning to trap and scout and survive in country that killed men who were not strong or smart enough, about the loneliness of the last 2 years, wandering without purpose or anchor. Clara told him about her father's stories, about growing up surrounded by books about adventure while living a quiet life in a growing town, about her mother's fear after becoming widowed, how it had infected Clara until she could not separate her own terror from her mother's legacy, about the guilt she felt for letting 3 years slip past while life happened beyond her windows, watched but never lived. They talked about everything and nothing, comfortable in ways Clara had never experienced with another person. Ethan made her laugh with stories about disasters in the wilderness, about the time he had gotten treed by an angry moose and had to wait 12 hours for it to leave, or when he had accidentally stepped in a hot spring and danced around cursing loud enough to scare every animal within 5 miles. She told him about problem guests, about the time a traveling preacher got drunk and tried to baptize everyone in the horse trough, or the couple who had 17 children and let them run absolutely wild through the inn for a week. But underneath the laughter and the stories, something deeper was growing, something that made Clara's breath catch when Ethan helped her onto her horse, his hands lingering on her waist. Something that made her hyper-aware of the space between them when they sat beside streams or on sun-warmed rocks. Something that felt both terrifying and inevitable, like a summer storm building on the horizon. On the 8th day, Ethan took her to a place he called Clearwater Basin, a high valley where a lake reflected the sky like polished glass. They tied the horses in the shade and walked to the water's edge, and Clara thought she had never seen anything so beautiful in her life. "I found this place the day after I came to Wilcox," Ethan said, standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Thought it was the most peaceful spot I had ever seen, but it feels different now, sharing it with you." "Different how?" "Better. Like it means something instead of just being pretty." Clara turned to look up at him, at this man who had somehow become essential to her in such a short time. The afternoon sun backlit him, turning his hair to gold and casting his face in partial shadow, but she could see his eyes, pale blue and intense, focused entirely on her. "Ethan, I need to tell you something." "I am listening." She took a breath, gathering courage. "I spent 3 years convincing myself I was safe behind my desk, that staying small and scared was the same as being protected. But safe is not the same as happy. You showed me that. You did not fix me or save me. You just reminded me that I was braver than I believed." "Clara, please let me finish before I lose my nerve." Her hands were shaking, but she pushed on. I am falling in love with you. Maybe I already have fallen. And I know you are leaving eventually. I know your work will take you away from Wilcox, but I needed you to know. Even if you do not feel the same, even if this has just been kindness on your part, I needed to say it out loud. You made me brave enough for that too. For a long moment, Ethan just stared at her, expression unreadable. Then he cupped her face in his large, calloused hands with a gentleness that made her want to cry. You think I do not feel the same? Clara, I have been half in love with you since that first day when you looked at me like I was a challenge instead of a threat. Do you know how rare that is? How rare you are. His thumb traced her cheekbone. I came to Wilcox planning to stay a week, finish my scouting, and move on. That is what I do, what I have done for 2 years. But then you stepped out of your safe place because I asked you to, and I started thinking maybe running was just another kind of hiding. What are you saying? I am saying I love you too. I am saying I do not want to leave. I am saying I am tired of being alone and I want to build something real with you, if you will have me. Clara's answer was to pull his head down to hers, to kiss him with all the pent-up longing and newfound courage she possessed. He made a sound low in his throat and pulled her closer, one arm banding around her waist like he would never let go. The kiss was everything her books had promised, and nothing like she expected, soft and hungry all at once, tasting of coffee and possibility. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. We should probably talk about practical things, about how this would work. Very practical, Clara agreed, then kissed him again because she could, because this magnificent man loved her back, and the world felt full of impossible things made real. They sat by the lake as the afternoon stretched long, making plans with the giddy excitement of people who had been lonely too long, and suddenly found themselves understood. Ethan would finish his scouting contract, which had another month to run, but he would make Wilcox his base instead of wandering. He had saved money over the years and could invest in the inn, helping Clara expand the business if she wanted. Or he could hire on as a guide for hunting parties, using his knowledge of the mountains to support them both. I do not need you to support me, Clara said, lacing her fingers through his. The inn does well enough, but I would love having you as a partner in business and in everything else. Everything else. His smile was slow and warm and made her stomach flip. I like the sound of that. They rode back to Wilcox as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold and deep purple. When they reached the inn, Ethan helped Clara down from her horse, then kissed her again right there in the street where anyone could see, claiming her publicly in a way that made her heart soar. Tomorrow, he asked. Every tomorrow, she promised. The town of Wilcox buzzed with gossip about Clara Reed and the mountain man who had coaxed her out of hiding. Some folks thought it sweet, a romance like something from the dime novels. Others worried he would break her heart and send her retreating even deeper into her shell. But mostly people were just happy to see Clara smiling again, to see life and color back in her face after 3 years of gray numbness. Clara found she did not care what anyone thought. For the first time in years, she was truly living instead of just existing, and the difference was intoxicating. Ethan finished his scouting work over the next few weeks, but true to his word, he returned to Wilcox after each trip. They fell into an easy rhythm, partners in ways that felt natural as breathing. He helped around the inn when he was in town, his size and strength useful for repairs Clara could never have managed alone. She helped him with paperwork and correspondence, her neat hand and head for numbers making his business dealings much simpler. But more than the practical partnership, they simply enjoyed each other. They rode out whenever possible, Ethan showing Clara more and more of the Wyoming territory she had feared for so long. They talked for hours, discovering shared opinions and comfortable disagreements. They learned each other's bodies slowly, carefully, with respect for propriety, but also with growing passion that made them both impatient for a wedding. Because that was the natural next step, obvious to both of them even without discussion. This was not some passing attraction, but something deep and solid, built on understanding and genuine affection. Ethan proposed officially on a crisp morning in September, 3 months after that first terrifying ride into the foothills. They were at Clearwater Basin again, the lake reflecting autumn colors in its still surface. He got down on one knee in the grass, a simple gold band in his calloused hand, and asked her to be his wife with such naked hope in his voice that tears sprang to her eyes. "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet. "Yes, absolutely yes." They married in October, a small ceremony at the church with half the town in attendance. Clara wore her mother's dress, altered to fit, and carried wildflowers that Ethan had picked that morning. He wore new clothes that he clearly found uncomfortable, tugging at his collar until Clara laughed and told him he could lose the tie. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor and adventure together through whatever life brought. When the preacher pronounced them married and Ethan kissed her, Clara felt the last chains of her old fear fall away entirely. They spent their wedding night at the inn, in the largest room on the top floor that had the best view of the mountains. Ethan was gentle and patient, understanding that while Clara was brave in many ways, this was new territory for both of them. They learned each other slowly, with quiet laughter and whispered words, and if they fumbled sometimes in their inexperience, it did not matter because they were together. Afterward, lying in Ethan's arms with her head on his chest, listening to the steady drum of his heartbeat, Clara thought about how far she had come. From a woman who could not walk out her own door to someone who had ridden into the mountains and found love and purpose. The journey was not over, she knew that. Some days would be harder than others, and old fears had a way of resurfacing when least expected. But she would not face those days alone anymore. Life settled into new patterns after the wedding. Ethan took fewer long-range scouting jobs, preferring work that kept him closer to Wilcox and Clara. He hired on with local ranchers who needed guides to new grazing land, or led hunting parties into the mountains for wealthy Easterners seeking adventure and trophies. The work paid well and kept him home more nights than not, which suited both of them. Clara expanded the inn's business, using Ethan's investment and her own savings to add 6 more rooms in a new wing. They hired more help, including a full-time desk clerk named Margaret, a widow who needed work and had a sharp mind for figures. This freed Clara to do more than just manage from behind her desk. She could work in the garden she planted behind the inn, growing vegetables and herbs for the kitchen. She could visit other businesses in town, building relationships instead of conducting everything through messengers. She could simply live without the constant terror that leaving would mean losing everything. But her favorite times were still the mornings when she and Ethan rode out together, exploring trails they had not yet traveled. He taught her to fish in cold mountain streams, to identify edible plants, to move quietly through the forest without disturbing the wildlife. She taught him to appreciate poetry, reading aloud by campfires while he listened with his head in her lap. They taught each other that healing from grief and fear was not a straight path but a winding trail, and that having a partner made even the difficult parts bearable. In the spring of 1879, Clara discovered she was pregnant. She told Ethan on a Sunday morning, handing him coffee with hands that shook only slightly with nerves. They had talked about wanting children, but the reality of it felt enormous. weighty with responsibility and possibility. "I saw the doctor yesterday," she said, watching his face. "He confirmed it. We are going to have a baby." Ethan set down his coffee very carefully, then pulled her into his arms with such fierce joy that she laughed breathlessly against his chest. "A baby. Clara, we are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" He pulled back to look at her, eyes bright. Happy does not begin to cover it, terrified too, but mostly happy. You, the same, both at once, all the time. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through spring and into summer. Clara felt well enough to keep working, though Ethan fussed over her like she was made of glass, which she found both annoying and endearing. He built a cradle from pine he cut himself, sanding it smooth and carving animals into the headboard, elk and eagles and bears to watch over their child. Clara sewed tiny clothes, amazed that a person could be small enough to fit into them. They argued cheerfully about names, neither willing to concede until they could actually meet the baby and see what fit. Ethan wanted something strong if it was a boy, traditional if a girl. Clara wanted something meaningful, connected to the people and places they loved. "What about Jane if it's a girl?" Ethan suggested one evening, his hand resting on Clara's swollen belly. "After my sister." "I think that's perfect," Clara said softly. "And if it's a boy, maybe Thomas, after my father, Thomas Pierce. That has a good sound to it." The baby decided to make an appearance on a hot August afternoon, 3 weeks earlier than the doctor had predicted. Clara's water broke while she was working in the garden, and Ethan, who had been repairing a fence nearby, went white as chalk when she told him. "Now. The baby is coming now." "Babies do not follow schedules," Clara said, trying to stay calm despite the first contraction starting to grip her belly. "Get the doctor, and Ethan, breathe. You look like you are going to faint." "I have faced down bears. I am not going to faint." That is what every man says right before he hits the floor. But Ethan held himself together, fetching the doctor and the midwife, getting Clara settled in their bedroom, and then hovering uselessly while the women worked. The labor was long, stretching through the afternoon and into the evening, Clara's cries of pain making Ethan pace the hallway like a caged animal. Finally, as the sun set in shades of red and gold, a baby's wail pierced the air. The midwife opened the door, smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Pierce." A big, healthy boy. Ethan was through the door before she finished speaking, crossing to the bed where Clara lay exhausted and radiant, holding a red-faced, squalling infant. He sat carefully beside her, looking at his son with such wonder that Clara felt her heart might burst. "Thomas," she said softly, "meet your papa." Ethan reached out one large finger and the baby's tiny hand wrapped around it instinctively. The crying stopped, replaced by solemn dark eyes studying this giant of a man who was suddenly his whole world. "Thomas," Ethan repeated, voice rough with emotion. "Thomas Reed Pierce, welcome to the world, son." He looked at Clara, and there were tears on his face that he made no move to hide. "Thank you. Thank you for him, for everything, for showing me what life could be." Clara shifted the baby so she could reach up and touch Ethan's face. "Thank you for reminding me I was brave enough to live it." They sat together, the three of them, as darkness fell outside and stars began to emerge. Downstairs, the inn continued its usual evening rhythm. Guests coming and going, dinners being served, life happening all around them. But in that room, time seemed suspended, holding just this moment, this beginning, this family they had built from loneliness and courage. Baby Thomas was a good child, healthy and curious, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's sighs. He grew quickly, rolling over early and crawling at 6 months, keeping both parents constantly watchful. Ethan proved to be a doting father, carrying the boy everywhere in a sling Clara fashioned. talking to him about mountains and horses, and all the things they would do together when Thomas was older. Clara discovered that motherhood suited her, though it was harder and stranger and more consuming than she had imagined. Some days, she felt overwhelmed by the responsibility, by the constant need and noise and chaos of caring for an infant. But Ethan was always there, taking Thomas when she needed to sleep, walking the floor with him during fussy nights, reminding her that they were partners in this too. The inn continued to thrive, Margaret managing the desk with competence that let Clara focus on her family without guilt. They hired a cook to help in the kitchen, a quiet woman named Sarah who had a gift with pastries. The new wing filled with guests drawn by the inn's reputation for cleanliness and good food. When Thomas was 8 months old, Ethan came home from a trip to Cheyenne with news. Met a man who is starting a guide service, wants to hire experienced scouts to lead expeditions into Yellowstone country. The pay is excellent, and the work would be seasonal, mostly summer when the passes are clear. Clara looked up from where she was playing with Thomas on a blanket. That sounds like something you would enjoy. I would, but it would mean being gone for weeks at a time. She considered, thinking about how far she had come from the woman who could not leave her desk. We will miss you terribly when you are gone. But I think you need work that feeds your spirit, not just pays the bills, and you would always come back to us. Always, he promised, kneeling beside them. Thomas immediately grabbed for his father's beard, laughing when Ethan pretended to roar like a bear. Every time I would come back. So Ethan took the seasonal work, leading wealthy tourists and scientists into the wild country where geysers erupted and hot springs painted the earth in impossible colors. He was usually gone 2 weeks out of every month during the summer, and Clara learned to manage without him while counting the days until his return. When he came home, sunburned and full of stories, they would fall into each other's arms with the passion of people who understood that time together was precious. The pattern worked well for their family. Ethan's income from the guide service, combined with the inn's profits, gave them financial security beyond what either had known growing up. They saved carefully, planning for Thomas's future and whatever other children might come. On a cold March evening in 1881, Clara told Ethan she was pregnant again. Thomas was playing with wooden blocks nearby, stacking them carefully, then knocking them down with shrieks of laughter. "Another one," Ethan said, pulling her close and resting his hand on her still flat belly. "Our family keeps growing. Are you happy? Happier than I ever thought possible. You, the same." She kissed him softly. "Always the same." This pregnancy was harder than the first, Clara sick more often and exhausted in ways that made even simple tasks feel monumental. Ethan postponed his first guide trip of the season to stay close, taking over more of the inn's physical work while Clara rested as much as a toddler would allow. But by summer she felt better, and she insisted Ethan take the work he had committed to. "We need the money, and I am fine." "Stop hovering." "I do not hover. You hover like a thundercloud. Margaret and Sarah can help with Thomas. Go, lead your expeditions, and come home safe." He went, but Clara received letters every week, pages filled with his rough handwriting detailing the things he saw and the people he guided, always ending with how much he missed her and Thomas, counting days until he could return. The baby came in November, during an early snowstorm that blanketed Wilcox in white. This labor was faster than Thomas's, and Ethan barely made it back from town with the doctor before their daughter arrived, squalling her displeasure at the cold world she had entered. "Jane," Clara said, looking at the red-faced baby with her father's pale blue eyes. "Jane Margaret Pierce." Ethan, holding Thomas on his lap to meet his new sister, looked at his wife with such love that she felt blessed beyond measure. Perfect. She is absolutely perfect. Jane was different from Thomas, more vocal and demanding, quick to cry but quick to smile too. She had her father's coloring and her mother's stubborn determination, a combination that promised challenges ahead. Thomas, at 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything and getting frustrated when told he was too little. The Pierce family settled into new routines, busier and louder and messier than before. Some days Clara felt like she was drowning in laundry and dishes and the endless needs of 2 small children. Some days she missed the simplicity of her old life behind the desk, even though she knew she would never truly want to go back. But then Ethan would come home from a long day and take over with the children, giving her space to breathe. Or Thomas would say something that made her laugh until her sides hurt. Or Jane would fall asleep in her arms, tiny and trusting and perfect. And Clara would remember that this chaos was what living actually meant, messy and hard and absolutely worth it. The years rolled forward in the way years do, marked by children's milestones and seasonal rhythms. Thomas grew tall like his father, serious and thoughtful, more interested in books than adventure, much to Ethan's bemused disappointment. Jane was the wild one, climbing everything, fearless in ways that terrified Clara, always wanting to go with her father into the mountains. In 1884, Clara discovered she was pregnant for a 3rd time. This one was unplanned, catching them both by surprise when Jane was not yet 3 and Thomas was just starting lessons at the schoolhouse in town. Clara was 30 years old and suddenly exhausted at the thought of starting over with a newborn. "We will manage," Ethan assured her, though she could see worry in his eyes too. "We always do. I know. I just thought we were done. 2 felt complete. Life has a way of surprising us." He pulled her close, his strength as comforting as it had been that very first day. "Remember when you thought you would never leave your desk? Now look at everything you have done, everything we have built together." Clara leaned into him, accepting the truth of his words. They would manage because they were partners, because they loved each other and their children, because they had both learned that courage meant facing the unexpected with open hearts. This pregnancy was the easiest of the 3, and Clara felt well enough to stay active throughout. The baby came in late summer of 1885, another boy they named Michael, after Ethan's father. He was a quiet baby, easy and content, seeming to understand that his parents were older and more tired this time around. Thomas, now 6, was helpful with his little brother in ways he had not been with Jane. Jane, at 3, was mostly just jealous of the attention the baby received and prone to dramatic tantrums that left Clara questioning her own sanity. But Ethan was endlessly patient with all 3 children, never raising his voice, always finding ways to make them feel loved and important. "How are you so good at this?" Clara asked one evening, watching him juggle all 3 children while she prepared dinner. "Practice. I practically raised Jane, remember? Plus, I think children are like wild animals. They sense fear and uncertainty. You have to be calm and confident. You did not just compare our children to wild animals. If the comparison fits." He dodged the dish towel she threw at him, laughing. "You love me anyway." "Unfortunately, I do." But it was not unfortunate at all. Even in the chaos of 3 children, even in the exhausting days and sleepless nights, even when money was tight or work was scarce or children were sick, Clara never once regretted building this life with Ethan. He was her anchor and her adventure, the man who had seen past her fear to the brave woman hiding underneath. The inn continued to be successful, now managed almost entirely by Margaret and a small staff. Clara still kept the books and made major decisions, but her focus had shifted to her family, and that felt right. She and Ethan talked sometimes about selling the inn, using the money to buy land and build something of their own, but they never quite pulled the trigger on such a big change. "The inn is part of our story," Clara said. "Where we met, where we figured out how to love each other. I am not ready to let it go yet." "Then we will keep it as long as you want," Ethan assured her. "I am in no hurry to change what works." When Thomas was 8, Jane 5, and Michael 3, Ethan took them all on their first real camping trip into the mountains. Clara worried obsessively about bears and cliffs and 1,000 other dangers, but Ethan's confidence finally convinced her. "They need to know the land," he said, "to understand where they come from and what is possible beyond town. Plus, you need to teach Jane before she decides to go exploring on her own." That argument convinced Clara more than any other, because Jane absolutely would wander off into the wilderness given half a chance. The trip was both wonderful and exhausting. 3 days camped beside a stream while Ethan taught the children to fish and identify plants and move quietly through the forest. Thomas took to it immediately, his serious nature perfect for patient observation. Jane loved it, but kept trying to do dangerous things, climbing too high or getting too close to the water. Michael mostly just wanted to be carried, which Ethan did without complaint. But on the last night, sitting around the campfire with all 3 children finally asleep in their bedrolls, Clara looked at Ethan across the flames and felt profound gratitude for the life they had built. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. For pushing me out of my comfortable cage, for loving me, for giving me this family." "You gave me just as much," he replied. "Gave me a reason to stop running, a place to call home, a future worth building. We saved each other, Clara." "I suppose we did." They were both older now, Ethan 36 and Clara 32, no longer the young people who had met 8 years before. They had more weight on them, more gray in Ethan's hair and lines around Clara's eyes. But they had also grown together, their love deepening with time and trial into something unshakable. The years continued their steady march. Thomas grew into a serious young man who loved learning, eventually heading to Denver for schooling when he turned 16. Jane became a handful in her teenage years, all passion and rebellion, keeping her parents constantly worried and exasperated. Michael was the gentle one, artistic and sensitive, sketching the mountains with a talent that surprised everyone. Ethan's work as a guide eventually became too physically demanding as he approached 40, and he transitioned to training younger men in wilderness skills. He was good at teaching, patient and thorough, and he found satisfaction in passing on knowledge he had spent decades accumulating. The work paid less than guiding, but by then they did not need as much, the inn providing steady income and their children mostly grown. Clara expanded her world steadily over the years, first venturing beyond Wilcox to visit other towns, then making longer trips with Ethan to Denver and Cheyenne, and even once to San Francisco. Each journey got easier, the old fear losing its grip as she built new memories to replace the old ones. She never forgot the 3 years she spent trapped behind her desk, but they became a cautionary tale rather than a prison, a reminder of what happened when fear was allowed to rule. On their 15th wedding anniversary in 1894, Ethan took Clara back to Clearwater Basin, the lake where he had first told her he loved her. They were both in their 40s now, their children grown or nearly so, their hair going gray and their bodies showing the wear of time and hard work. But when Ethan took her hand and pulled her close, when he kissed her beside that mirror-still lake, Clara felt exactly as she had 15 years before, young and brave and desperately in love. 15 years, Ethan mused, his arm around her shoulders as they watched sunset paint the water gold and red. Feels like forever and no time at all. I know what you mean. Sometimes I still feel like that terrified woman who could not leave her desk. Then I look at our life, our children, everything we have done together, and I barely recognize her. She is still part of you, though. The brave part, the part that took that first terrifying step. You did not leave her behind, you just learned she was stronger than she thought. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, breathing in the pine and leather scent of him that had become synonymous with home. I could not have done any of it without you. Sure, you could have. Maybe not as fast or in the same way, but you would have found your courage eventually. I just got lucky enough to be there when you did. They stayed until full dark, wrapped in each other's arms under emerging stars, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting. The mountains rose around them, eternal and patient, witnesses to their love story that had started in fear and blossomed into joy. As they rode back to Wilcox under a full moon, Clara thought about that first terrifying morning when she had forced herself onto a horse and out of her self-imposed prison. She thought about mountain lions and wild places, about learning to be brave one small step at a time. She thought about the inn that was no longer a cage but just a building, bricks and mortar that held memories, but did not define her. But mostly she thought about Ethan Pierce, the mountain man who had seen past her fear to the woman underneath, who had loved her enough to be patient while she found herself, who had given her adventures more real and meaningful than anything she had ever read in books. And she thought about how the best adventure of all had not been the places they went or the things they saw, but simply learning to live fully, to love completely, to be brave enough to build a life together. Thomas graduated from school and returned to Wilcox, bringing with him a quiet young woman named Anne who became his wife. They settled nearby, giving Ethan and Clara their first grandchild in 1897, a little girl named Clara after her grandmother. Jane, true to form, married a wanderer, a photographer who traveled the West capturing images of the disappearing frontier. She visited when she could, always with new stories and wild energy that left her parents exhausted. Michael stayed close, opening a small studio in Wilcox where he painted landscapes that people came from miles around to purchase. The inn eventually sold to a young couple from back east, people who loved the building and its history and promised to honor its legacy. Clara let it go without regret because it had served its purpose, given her security when she needed it, and then released her when she was ready. Ethan and Clara bought a small house on the edge of Wilcox, with a porch that faced the mountains and a garden where Clara grew vegetables and flowers in wild profusion. They settled into a peaceful rhythm, grandchildren visiting often, children stopping by for advice or just company, the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived settling over them like a comfortable blanket. On a spring morning in 1902, Clara woke to find Ethan already up, sitting on the porch with coffee watching the sun rise over the peaks they had explored together for more than 2 decades. She brought her own cup and settled beside him, both of them content in comfortable silence. "What are you thinking about?" she asked eventually. "Just remembering. That first day I walked into the inn, you looked so fierce behind your desk, like you were daring the world to come at you. I thought you were the most interesting person I had ever seen. I thought you were terrifying. All that size and those intense eyes. I could barely write your name, I was shaking so hard. And now look at us, old and gray and still sitting together. I would not want to be anywhere else." Ethan reached over and took her hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "I love you, Clara Pierce. Just as much now as that day at the lake, maybe more. Thank you for saying yes to that first ride, for being brave enough to let me in. I love you too. Thank you for seeing past my fear, for believing I was braver than I thought, for giving me a life full of adventure and love and purpose. They sat together as the sun climbed higher, warming the spring air, bringing the promise of another season of growth and beauty. Behind them, their house held the accumulation of decades, photographs and memories, and the comfortable chaos of a family well loved. Around them, Wilcox was waking up, the town that had been both prison and sanctuary, witness to a love story that started with fear and ended in joy. And before them, the mountains rose eternal and patient, the wild places where Clara had learned to be brave, where she and Ethan had built their love one adventure at a time, where they would always be young in memory even as their bodies aged. The years after their 25th anniversary were gentle ones, life slowing to a pace that suited them both. Ethan still took occasional trips into the mountains, but shorter ones now, his knees complaining on steep trails and his breath coming harder at altitude. Clara kept a small vegetable stand at the farmer's market, selling produce and cut flowers, enjoying the social aspect more than the money. Their grandchildren grew, 5 in total by 1905, each unique and wonderful. They hosted family dinners every Sunday, the house full of noise and laughter and the kind of comfortable chaos that came from being deeply loved. Ethan told the grandchildren stories about their adventures, about mountain lions and hidden valleys and their grandmother's courage. Clara read to them from her father's old books, passing on her love of stories to another generation. Jane returned home for an extended visit in 1906, her photographer husband having passed from pneumonia the winter before. She was 41 and grieving, needing the comfort of her childhood home and parents who understood loss. Clara held her daughter while she cried, and Ethan took her on long walks in the mountains, letting the wilderness work its healing magic. "I do not know how to do this," Jane said one evening, the three of them sitting together on the porch. "How to keep going when everything hurts." "You do what your mother did," Ethan said. "You take it one step at a time, one day at a time. You let people who love you help carry the weight. And eventually, you find reasons to keep moving forward." "It took me a long time to learn that," Clara added, "but your father was patient, and now we will be patient with you." Jane stayed for 6 months, slowly knitting herself back together. When she finally left, it was with better color in her face and plans to continue her husband's photography work in his memory. Clara and Ethan watched her go with the bittersweet knowledge that their children were truly adults now, living their own lives, facing their own challenges. "We did all right with them," Ethan said, his arm around Clara's waist. "They all turned out strong and good. We did more than all right. We gave them everything we had." The world was changing rapidly around them as the new century found its rhythm. Automobiles appeared in Wilcox, noisy contraptions that scared the horses. Electricity came to some buildings, though Clara and Ethan's house remained lamp-lit. Talk of war in Europe seemed impossibly distant, though young men from town were already enlisting, seeking adventure or fleeing boredom. But in their small corner of Wyoming, time moved slower, measured in seasons and grandchildren's visits, and the steady accumulation of days well spent. On their 30th anniversary in 1909, Clara was 53 and Ethan 59. They were undeniably old now, their bodies creaking in ways that would have seemed impossible in youth. But they were together, and that made everything else bearable. Ethan took her to Clearwater Basin one last time that summer, the journey taking twice as long as it once had, both of them riding slower and stopping more often. But the lake was still there, still perfect, still reflecting the sky like polished glass. 30 years, Clara said, standing at the water's edge holding Ethan's hand. 3 children, 5 grandchildren, more adventures than I can count. We built something good, did we not? The best thing I have ever been part of. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Clara. Every single day, I have thanked God or fate or luck that I walked into that inn when I did. I used to think I was trapped, that my fear had built walls I could never climb over, but you showed me the walls were only in my mind, that I could choose to be brave. She turned to face him, this man who had been her partner and lover and friend for 3 decades. You gave me the world, Ethan Pierce. Thank you does not seem like enough. Then just love me. That has always been enough. Forever, I promise. They kissed beside the lake, old and gray and beautiful in their own way. 2 people who had taken their broken pieces and built something whole together. The ride back was slower still, both of them tired in ways that went beyond physical exertion. But they made it home safe, to their house full of memories and the grandchildren waiting on the porch. And Clara thought there was grace in growing old beside someone you loved. Ethan's health began failing in the winter of 1911. Nothing dramatic at first, just increasing fatigue and a cough that would not quite clear. The doctor said his lungs were scarred from years in harsh weather, that he should rest and stay warm. Ethan, stubborn as always, insisted he was fine, but by spring it was clear he was not fine. The cough was worse, keeping him up nights, and he had lost weight his large frame could not afford to spare. Clara fussed over him, making rich soups and forcing him to rest, while inside her heart twisted with fear she had not felt in decades. I am not ready, she told him one evening, sitting beside their bed where he was supposed to be resting. I am not ready to do this without you. You are the bravest person I know, he said, his voice rough from coughing. You will be fine. I will be alone. Never alone. You have our children, our grandchildren, this whole life we built together. I will just be in the next room waiting for you to catch up eventually. That is not funny. It is a little funny, but he squeezed her hand. I am not planning on going anywhere soon, Clara. I am too stubborn for that. He held on through summer, rallying enough in the warm months to sit on the porch and tell stories to grandchildren who sensed something was wrong, but were too young to understand mortality. Clara stayed by his side constantly, memorizing the sight of him, the sound of his voice, the feeling of his hand in hers. On a September evening, with the first hint of autumn in the air, Ethan called all 3 of their children to the house. Thomas came from across town with his family. Michael closed his studio for the day. Jane arrived by train from Denver, where she had been showing her photographs, dropping everything when she got the telegram. They gathered around Ethan's bed, 3 grown children and their families, and Clara saw her own fear reflected in their faces. I need to tell you all something, Ethan said, his voice weak but still that same deep rumble that had first made Clara's breath catch 3 decades ago. Your mother is the strongest person I have ever known. When I met her, she was trapped by fear but fighting it every single day. She took a chance on me, on adventure, on living instead of just existing, and she built all of this. He gestured weakly to encompass the house, the family, the life they had created. When I am gone, you need to remember that. She does not need protecting or managing. She needs your love and respect and the knowledge that she raised 3 incredible people. Papa, do not, Jane said, tears streaming down her face. I need to say this while I can. He looked at Clara then, pale eyes still intense despite his weakness. And you need to remember too. You were brave enough to ride into the mountains with a stranger. You are brave enough for whatever comes next. Not without you. Especially without me. You do not need me to be strong, Clara. You never did. I just got to be there while you figured that out. He died 2 days later, quietly in his sleep with Clara holding his hand. The town turned out for his funeral, people whose lives he had touched over 3 decades in Wilcox. The preacher spoke about his service as a guide, his reputation for fairness and skill, his love for his family. But Clara barely heard any of it, numb with grief that felt like being buried alive. They laid him to rest on a hillside overlooking the mountains he had loved, and Clara stood beside the grave long after everyone else had left, trying to accept that he was truly gone. The months after Ethan's death were the hardest of Clara's life, harder even than losing her parents, because then she had not known what she was missing. Now she knew exactly what she had lost, and the hole he left was enormous and unfillable. Her children tried to help, visiting constantly, suggesting she sell the house and move in with one of them. But Clara refused, clinging to the home she and Ethan had shared, unable to let go of the memories soaked into every board and nail. She stopped gardening, stopped going to the market, stopped doing much of anything except sitting on the porch staring at the mountains and remembering. It was Jane who finally broke through, arriving unannounced in December with her camera equipment and a determined expression Clara recognized from her own mirror. "Get up," Jane said without preamble. "You are coming with me. I do not want to go anywhere. Too bad. Papa spent 30 years teaching you to be brave, and you are not going to waste that now by giving up. Jane, please, I am tired. You are grieving. That is different. But he would not want you to stop living just because he did. You know that." Clara did know that. Ethan had told her as much during their last conversation, reminding her that she was strong enough for anything. But knowing and doing were not the same thing. Still, she let Jane pull her up, let her daughter help her into warm clothes and out to the wagon where Michael waited with a sympathetic expression. They drove out of town, and Clara did not have the energy to ask where they were going until they pulled up at Clearwater Basin. The lake was frozen, snow covering the ground in pristine white, and it was heartbreakingly beautiful. Clara got out of the wagon slowly, staring at this place that held so many memories. "Papa brought me here when I was little," Jane said, standing beside her mother. "Told me about proposing to you here, about how this was where you both realized love was real. He said it was the most important place in his life, and we needed to know about it. He brought you here, all 3 of us at different times. Told us the stories, made sure we understood how special you were, how special your love was." Jane took her mother's hand. "You are grieving, and that is okay. That is right and necessary, but eventually you have to keep living. Not because you are forgetting him, but because you remember what he taught you." Clara looked at the frozen lake, at the mountains rising beyond, at the wild country where she had learned to be brave. And she felt something crack inside her chest, ice around her heart beginning to thaw. "I do not know how to do this without him. The same way you did everything with him, one step at a time." Clara stood at that lake for a long time, letting herself feel everything, the grief and loss and love all tangled together. And slowly, like spring coming to the mountains, she began to accept that Ethan was gone, but what he had given her remained. She started small, the way he had taught her years ago. A walk around the block, then down to the market, then out to visit her son and his family. Each outing was hard. Each time she came home to an empty house, the loneliness threatened to swallow her. But she kept moving forward, kept choosing to live, because she had promised Ethan she was brave enough. By the following spring, Clara was functioning again, if not quite whole. She reopened her garden, taking comfort in the familiar rhythm of planting and tending and coaxing life from the earth. She started attending church again, reconnecting with friends who had given her space to grieve but welcomed her back warmly. And she began writing, something she had never tried before. She wrote about Ethan, about their adventures, about the woman she had been, and the woman she had become. The words poured out like water long dammed, filling page after page with her memories. Her grandchildren loved the stories, begging her to read them aloud during Sunday dinners. Her children found comfort in hearing about their father, about the love story that had created their family. And Clara found a kind of peace in the telling, in making sure that Ethan Pierce and what he meant would never be forgotten. In 1913, Clara was 57 and had been a widow for 2 years. She had survived longer than she thought possible without Ethan, had even found moments of genuine happiness among the grief. She knew he would be proud of her for that, for choosing to keep living when giving up would have been easier. On what would have been their 35th anniversary, she rode out to Clearwater Basin alone. She was older and slower, her body protesting the journey, but she made it. She stood beside the lake, now thawed and reflecting summer sky, and talked to Ethan as if he could hear her. "I did it," she said to the wind and the water and the mountains. "I kept going like you told me to. I am still brave, still living, still remembering everything you taught me, and I will keep going until it is my turn to join you in whatever comes next. But know that every single day I have loved you. Every single day I have been grateful for the life we built together. You were my great adventure, Ethan Pierce. Thank you for taking a chance on a scared woman who never left her desk. Thank you for showing me the world." She stayed until sunset, at peace in this place that held their history, then rode home to her children and grandchildren, and the full life she had built on the foundation Ethan had helped her create. Clara lived another 15 years after Ethan's death, aging with grace into a woman who was respected and loved throughout Wilcox. She saw her grandchildren grow and marry, held great-grandchildren in her arms, and told stories that kept Ethan alive in memory even as the frontier they had known disappeared into history. When she died in 1926 at the age of 70, peacefully in her sleep, the whole town mourned. Her children buried her beside Ethan on the hillside overlooking the mountains, finally reuniting the two people whose love story had been remarkable for its simplicity and depth. They carved both headstones with the same words. They were brave enough to live. And in Wilcox, Wyoming, their descendants would tell the story for generations to come, about the innkeeper who never left her desk and the mountain man who took her on adventures she had only read about, and how their love had proven that courage and partnership could overcome anything. The story lived on in the photographs Jane took of the mountains her father had loved, in the landscapes Michael painted showing the wild country where his parents had adventured, in the way Thomas raised his children with the same patient understanding Ethan had shown. And it lived on in every person who heard their tale and decided to be just a little braver, to take that first terrifying step toward the life they wanted instead of the one fear had chosen for them. Because Clara and Ethan Pierce had proven something important in their 30 years together. That love could transform fear into courage, that partnership could heal old wounds, and that the greatest adventure was not found in any mountain or valley, but in choosing to live fully beside someone who saw your worth even when you could not see it yourself. Their house in Wilcox eventually became a museum, preserved by their descendants as a testament to their legacy. Visitors could see Clara's desk from the inn, the ledger with Ethan's name carefully recorded in her perfect script from that first day. They could see the cradle he had carved for their firstborn, and Clara's wedding dress, and the books they had shared on wilderness adventures. They could walk through rooms where 3 children had grown, where love had been nurtured daily in small gestures and large sacrifices. But most of all, they could learn the story, passed down with care and embellishment, about the young woman trapped by fear and the mountain man who helped her remember she was brave. About first rides and mountain lions, about Clearwater Basin and promises spoken beside a mirror lake, about 30 years of choosing each other every single day. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when light slanted through the windows just right, people swore they could feel their presence still. Two souls who had loved so deeply that even death could not fully separate them. A woman who learned courage could conquer anything, and a man who proved that strength came in gentle hands and patient hearts. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and left a legacy measured not in wealth or fame but in family and memories, and the knowledge that they had been exactly what each other needed. And really, what more could anyone ask from a life well lived?